The sun bows low in a river's gleam, whispers of
What if everything you've been told about Queen Cleopatra is a lie?
climbs, it steals the glow.
What if the real Queen of Egypt wasn't a white temptress, but a divine African ruler whose power shook empires and defied Rome itself?
Where the golden eclipse
She conquered men who conquered nations, yet history called her a seductress, not a strategist. Why did the world rewrite the story of the most powerful woman who ever lived? Behind the legend of beauty lies a story they never wanted you to know. She was not just a queen, but the embodiment of divine royalty. Her enemies feared her mind more than her charm.
sand remembers, but it
They buried her truth, but the sands of time whisper her secrets still. Cleopatra's legacy didn't die, it lives within every woman who refuses to be erased.
is it fate?
For centuries, Queen Cleopatra has been portrayed as a seductive temptress, a woman who used beauty to control powerful men. Hollywood turned her into a symbol of desire, casting white actresses with pale skin and blue eyes, draped in gold and eyeliner. But behind the fantasy lies a distortion so deep that it robbed Africa of one of its most powerful daughters. The real Cleopatra was no mere courtesan, she was a scholar, linguist, naval commander, and the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruling a world at war with itself. The myth began when Roman historians, mostly men who feared her influence, rewrote her image after her death. To them, Cleopatra had to be discredited, because she had outsmarted Julius Caesar, defied the Senate, and almost redefined Rome's destiny. They called her manipulative and immoral. But ancient Egyptian records and Greek sources tell another story, of a ruler fluent in 9 languages, a queen trained in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and a woman who restored Egypt's economy from collapse. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Yet, unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra embraced Egyptian identity. She was the first of her bloodline to speak the native Egyptian tongue and worship the old gods. She dressed in the sacred robes of Isis, the mother goddess, and was revered as the living embodiment of divine wisdom and power. To her people, she was not just a queen, she was Isis reborn. But as Rome's empire grew hungry for Egypt's gold and grain, Cleopatra found herself trapped between 2 worlds, the dying gods of Africa and the rising armies of Europe. To the Egyptians, she was the daughter of Ra. To Rome, she was an enemy too intelligent to be allowed to live. And so, propaganda became a weapon sharper than any sword. By painting her as a witch, a harlot, and a deceiver, the Romans ensured her power would die in the imagination of the world. Yet the truth endures in the silence of Egypt's temples and the whispers of her statues. Cleopatra's beauty was not in her face, but in her mind. She used strategy, psychology, and divine authority to hold an empire together for 2 decades against the might of Rome. Behind every myth they told about her lies a warning: when a woman wields wisdom equal to men, the world calls her dangerous. Cleopatra's lineage was no ordinary royal blood, it was a divine mixture of ancient power, intellect, and mystery. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Greek rulers who had conquered Egypt after Alexander the Great's death. But Cleopatra VII stood apart from her ancestors. She broke the foreign barrier and embraced the soul of Africa, aligning herself with the ancient bloodline of the pharaohs and the gods of Kemet. For the first time in centuries, Egypt had a ruler who reclaimed its spirit, not through conquest, but through faith. Unlike her predecessors, who ruled from marble halls and spoke Greek, Cleopatra spoke the language of her people, the sacred Egyptian tongue. She understood that Egypt was not built by Greece or Rome, but by black dynasties that traced their origin to Nubia, Kush, and the heart of the African Nile. This understanding transformed her rule. Cleopatra began to revive the forgotten rituals of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order that had guided the ancient pharaohs. She saw herself as not just a monarch but a living vessel of divine justice. Her spiritual transformation began when she became an initiate of the cult of Isis, the great mother goddess of fertility, magic, and rebirth. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was the physical embodiment of Horus, the son of Isis, and the protector of the divine order. Cleopatra's devotion to Isis was not symbolic, it was political and sacred. She adorned herself in golden robes, the ankh of life around her neck, and the serpent crown that symbolized divine authority and protection. Through Isis, Cleopatra united religion and rule, spirit and state. She made Egypt believe again. Archaeological findings show Cleopatra built temples, restored ancient sanctuaries, and reconnected the priesthood with the throne, something that had long been lost under her Greek ancestors. Her reign was marked by renewed respect for African spirituality, from the worship of Osiris and Hathor to the ceremonial rites of the Nile. Her palace in Alexandria became a temple of knowledge, where astronomers, healers, and mystics gathered from across Africa. Cleopatra's Egypt was more than a kingdom, it was a revival of sacred civilization. But this spiritual power made her dangerous to Rome. A queen who claimed divine origin could not be controlled by mortal men. Her knowledge of the gods made her unshakable, her voice impossible to silence. To her people, she was the living Isis. To her enemies, she was a mystery wrapped in gold and prophecy. And so, Rome began to plot not just against Egypt, but against the soul of a woman who carried the wisdom of thousands of years.
The tail, the ibis soars, its wings turn pale.
In the cold chambers of Roman power, Cleopatra was whispered about like a myth, a woman whose words could twist the fate of empires. Yet, her weapons were not armies or gold, but intelligence, charisma, and a mastery of human psychology. When she sailed to meet Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, she didn't arrive as a defeated queen but as Egypt incarnate. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's palace, rolled inside a carpet, emerging before him not as a captive but as a vision, radiant, fearless, and divine. Caesar, one of the greatest conquerors of all time, was instantly captivated, not by lust, but by power recognizing power. Cleopatra understood that to save Egypt, she needed Rome, but on her terms. Her union with Caesar was not seduction, it was strategy. Through him, she secured her throne, restored Egypt's autonomy, and produced an heir, Caesar Ion, symbol of unity between East and West. In private, Cleopatra discussed astronomy and governance with Caesar. In public, she ruled beside him as an equal, a living embodiment of the goddess Isis. The Roman Senate saw in her a terrifying possibility, a woman not only ruling men but shaping destiny itself. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra turned her gaze toward Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general. She invited him to Tarsus, where her arrival would become legend. Draped in gold, her ship scented with incense, and musicians echoing across the river, Cleopatra appeared as if Isis herself had descended from heaven. Antony, brave in battle but reckless in heart, was no match for her presence. Their alliance would become one of the greatest political and romantic sagas in history, born not from passion alone, but from mutual ambition. Together, Cleopatra and Antony dreamed of a new world order, a rebirth of the old Egyptian empire that would stretch from the Nile to India. She supplied his armies with ships, gold, and wisdom. He, in turn, crowned her Queen of Kings. But in Rome, the propaganda grew louder. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's rival, branded Cleopatra a foreign witch who had bewitched a Roman hero. The battle for Egypt's sovereignty turned into a war for its queen's reputation. To Rome, Cleopatra became the serpent of the Nile, a woman who dared to challenge male dominion with intellect and mystique. But to Africa, she was a strategist who used the tools denied to her, femininity, diplomacy, and divine wisdom, to outmaneuver the most powerful men of her age. She didn't just play the Game of Thrones, she rewrote its rules. And for that, the empire would come for her, determined to destroy both the woman and the legend she had become.
The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony terrified Rome. Together, they represented a new kind of empire, one not bound by the Senate or Caesar's legacy, but by the union of Eastern wisdom and African power. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and the future Emperor Augustus, could not allow that. He began a ruthless propaganda campaign, painting Cleopatra as a sorceress who had enslaved Antony's heart and bewitched Rome's honor. In truth, it wasn't love that threatened him, it was Cleopatra's vision of sovereignty, where Egypt ruled itself and defied foreign domination. In 31 BCE, war erupted. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their fleets on the glittering waters of Actium. She commanded her ships like a seasoned admiral, her sails dyed purple, her flag adorned with the eye of Horus. But betrayal was already brewing in their ranks. Roman spies, bribes, and divided loyalties turned the tide before battle even began. The Battle of Actium ended not with Cleopatra's weakness, but with the treachery of men who feared a woman's command. As defeat loomed, she withdrew to Alexandria, knowing the final act of her destiny had begun. Octavian's armies advanced like a storm upon Egypt. Antony, broken and desperate, fought until his forces surrendered. According to ancient accounts, he fell on his own sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms within the mausoleum she had prepared for herself. But Cleopatra was not done fighting. Even as Rome claimed victory, she met Octavian with regal defiance, adorned in gold and linen, refusing to kneel. In that chamber, Africa's last pharaoh faced Europe's first emperor, and she chose death over chains. Her final moments remain shrouded in mystery. The Roman tale says she died from the bite of an asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra, symbol of divine royalty. Others believe she drank a venomous elixir, prepared by her priests, ensuring her spirit would rise to join Isis and Osiris among the gods. Octavian demanded her body, but he never found her tomb. Some say her priests hid her remains in a secret temple along the Nile, beyond the reach of Rome's desecration. Her death ended 3,000 years of Egyptian kingship, but also birthed an immortal legend. The fall of Cleopatra was not merely the end of a dynasty, it was the death of Africa's last sovereign civilization before the shadow of foreign rule descended for centuries. Yet, in her final act, Cleopatra achieved victory through defiance. Rome may have conquered her kingdom, but it could never conquer her name. Her story, like the Nile, continued to flow, mysterious, eternal, and defiant of oblivion.
Sand remembers, but it won't tell. Fading light.
Centuries have passed, but Cleopatra's shadow still stretches across time, mystical, misunderstood, and magnificent. The Romans thought they had buried her, yet every civilization since has tried to resurrect her image. To the West, she became a temptress, to poets, a muse, to scholars, a mystery. But to Africa, she remains something far greater, a symbol of divine womanhood, intelligence, and resistance. Cleopatra was not just the last pharaoh of Egypt, she was the final flame of a continent that once ruled the ancient world through wisdom, balance, and spiritual power. Her legend did not die in Alexandria's tombs, it migrated across deserts, seas, and generations. In Nubia, Ethiopia, and the kingdom of Kush, queens like Amenarines and Makeda, the queen of Sheba, carried her spirit forward, standing against empires and writing new chapters of African sovereignty. In the modern world, Cleopatra's legacy inspired a wave of rediscovery among historians and artists who challenged the Eurocentric image that whitewashed her identity. DNA research and ancient art reveal her to be of mixed African and Greek descent, with features that reflected Egypt's diverse bloodlines, not the Hollywood fantasy created centuries later. Cleopatra's story is not just history, it is a lesson about power, perception, and truth. Her enemies understood that if they could rewrite her image, they could erase the idea of a brilliant African woman who ruled men, built empires, and bent destiny itself. That is why she was recast as a seductress instead of a strategist, a lover instead of a leader. But history, like the Nile, always resurfaces. Today, her name stands beside the greatest monarchs of all time, not because of beauty or romance, but because she dared to rule as both woman and god. In the spiritual realm, Cleopatra became immortal. Her worship as Isis incarnate continued for centuries, her temples filled with offerings long after her death. Even Rome, the empire that destroyed her, adopted her symbols, crowns, serpents, and sun discs, into its art and religion. She had conquered them not through war, but through memory. In her story lies a paradox. They tried to erase her, but by doing so, they made her eternal. Today, every woman who commands her space, who leads with both grace and power, carries a spark of Cleopatra's fire. Every African who reclaims their heritage echoes her defiance. Cleopatra's truth was never about seduction, it was about sovereignty. And as long as her story is told, she will never be a myth again. She will remain what she always was, a goddess who refused to kneel before an empire.
Its wings turn pale, sand remembers, but it won't tell. Fading light, a lover's stare.
Cleopatra, the goddess who refused to kneel. They told us she died in despair, but the truth is, Cleopatra never died. She lives in the memory of every woman who leads, every mind that refuses to be silenced, every nation that dares to rise after being conquered. Her name was not just written in papyrus scrolls, it was etched in the stars. The Romans built empires with steel, but she built hers with wisdom. And wisdom, unlike empires, never falls. They said she used beauty to rule men. But history forgot, she used intelligence to rule empires. They said she was Greek, but her spirit belonged to Africa, to the land where the gods walked among mortals. They said she was a lover. They never said she was a liberator. Cleopatra's throne may have turned to sand, but her story is still a mirror, reflecting what the world fears most, a woman who cannot be conquered. If history was written by those who feared her, then today, we rewrite it. Because Cleopatra was not the end of an empire, she was the beginning of a legend. If you believe history deserves the truth, hit subscribe. Comment, I stand with Cleopatra. and turn on notifications to uncover more hidden African stories they tried to erase. Because this is just the beginning.